By December 1941, Nazi Germany stood 15 miles from the Kremlin. 3 million Soviet soldiers had been captured, entire armies had vanished into encirclements. The Luftwaffe had destroyed thousands of aircraft on the ground. Stalin had disappeared for 11 days, paralyzed by catastrophe. Every rational calculation pointed towards Soviet collapse within weeks. Yet 4 years later, on May 9th, 1945, the red flag flew over the Reichstag in Berlin. The state that should have shattered became the force that shattered Nazi Germany. How did history's most devastating invasion fail to break the Soviet Union? What mechanisms of state power, human resilience, and sheer brutality transformed catastrophic victim into conquering superpower? And what price did 27 million dead pay for that survival? To understand this paradox, we must trace the arc from June 1941, when the world expected Soviet annihilation, to May 1945, when Soviet troops stormed Hitler's capital. This is not a story of inevitable victory or ideological triumph. It is the story of a totalitarian state that survived because it could impose sacrifices unthinkable in any other society, trade space for time across geography vast enough to swallow armies, and accept casualty rates that would have broken democratic nations. Machinery of dictatorship that oppressed millions proved paradoxically capable of channeling their suffering into military power. The catastrophe began at 3:15 a. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, named for a medieval German emperor, launched with three 8 million Axis troops across an 800-mile front. It was the largest invasion in human history. 3,000 Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the first day, most on the ground before pilots could scramble. Panzer spearheads sliced through Soviet defenses like scalpels through flesh. Within hours, communications collapsed. Entire armies lost contact with Moscow. Commanders had no idea where enemy forces were, where their own flanks stood, or what orders to follow. Stalin had ignored warnings. British intelligence had alerted him. His own spies had confirmed German preparations. Even a German defector had crossed the lines the night before to warn of the attack. Stalin dismissed them all as provocations designed to drag the Soviet Union into war prematurely. When the invasion came, he retreated to his dacha and vanished for 11 days. Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov announced the invasion to the Soviet people while their leader suffered what appears to have been a nervous breakdown. Even totalitarian certainty could crack under catastrophe's weight. What followed was slaughter on a scale difficult to comprehend. The Germans encircled Soviet forces at Minsk within 6 days, capturing 300,000 soldiers. At Smolensk in July, another 300,000 disappeared into German captivity. But the catastrophe that defined the opening phase came at Kiev in September. Stalin refused to authorize retreat, insisting the city be held at all costs. 4 Soviet armies were encircled. When the pocket collapsed on September 26th, 665,000 Soviet soldiers were captured, the largest encirclement in military history. To put that in perspective, the entire British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk numbered 340,000 men. The Germans captured nearly twice that number in a single battle. By December 1941, the Soviet Union had lost over 4 million soldiers, killed, captured, or missing. That's more than the entire population of Norway. German troops stood at the gates of Leningrad in the north, besieging the city that would endure 872 days of starvation. In the center, advance units reached the suburbs of Moscow, close enough to see the Kremlin's spires through binoculars. In the south, Rostov had fallen, opening the path toward the Caucasus oil fields. Every military analyst in the world expected Soviet collapse within weeks. Why didn't it happen? The answer begins with something the Germans had not accounted for: space. The distance from the Soviet western border to Moscow was 1,000 miles. The distance from Germany's pre-war border to Moscow was 1,800 miles. The Wehrmacht had advanced farther in 6 months than Napoleon had in his entire 1812 campaign, yet they had not destroyed the Soviet state. They had merely pushed it eastward. Every mile the Germans advanced stretched their supply lines thinner. Every mile the Soviets retreated, they fell back closer to their reserves, their factories, their reinforcements. Russia's greatest allies had always been General Winter and Field Marshal Distance. In 1941, they proved it again. and then came the counteroffensive. On December 5, 1941, General Georgy Zhukov launched a counterattack. With fresh Siberian divisions, Stalin had gambled by pulling from the Far East. The Germans, strung out along frozen supply lines, unprepared for winter warfare, were driven back. Not routed, the Wehrmacht was too professional for that, but pushed back 150 miles from Moscow's gates. The Red Army suffered 1 million casualties in the winter campaign, but they had achieved something more valuable than ground. They had proven the Germans were not invincible. The Blitzkrieg could be stopped. The myth of Wehrmacht supremacy had cracked. But survival required more than defensive victories. It required transforming the Soviet Union into a war machine, capable of matching German industrial output. And that transformation was already underway in one of history's most remarkable logistical feats. As German armies advanced in the summer and fall of 1941, the Soviet State Defense Committee ordered the wholesale evacuation of Western industry. The numbers are staggering. Between July and December 1941, 1943 factories were dismantled, loaded onto 1.5 million railway cars, and moved east to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. 10 million workers and their families were relocated. Entire factory floors were torn up, machinery packed, blast furnaces cooled, and transported thousands of miles beyond German reach. Picture the scene. Workers in the Urals reassembling tank factories in open fields with winter temperatures dropping to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Machinery operating exposed to the elements because there was no time to construct buildings. Production lines starting before walls existed. By January 1942, tank production had been restored. By 1943, Soviet factories were producing 24,000 tanks annually. Germany, with all its occupied territories, produced 19,000. The war was being won in the foundries as much as on the battlefields. But industrial output meant nothing without the organization to deploy it, the discipline to prevent collapse, and the terror to enforce obedience. This is where Stalin's totalitarian system revealed its darkest utility. On July 28, 1942, Stalin issued Order Number 227, better known as Not One Step Back. The order was blunt. Retreat without authorization meant execution. Blocking detachments were formed, NKVD troops positioned behind frontline units with orders to shoot anyone who ran. Commanders who retreated faced military tribunals. Soldiers suspected of cowardice were sent to penal battalions used for suicidal missions like clearing minefields by marching through them. By war's end, blocking detachments had shot 158,000 Soviet troops. Families of soldiers who surrendered or deserted were arrested and imprisoned. Soviet soldiers fought with German guns at their front and NKVD pistols at their back. Motivation was not ideology or patriotism. It was survival. Fight and you might die. Retreat and you would certainly die, along with your family. The totalitarian state that had terrorized its own population in the 1930s now channeled that same ruthlessness toward military discipline. It was brutal. It was inhumane. And it worked. The Soviet system could impose sacrifices impossible in democratic societies. Entire ethnic populations were deported. Volga Germans, Crimean Tatars, Chechens, accused of potential collaboration and shipped to Central Asia in cattle cars. Cities like Leningrad endured starvation that killed 100,000 people monthly in the winter of 1941. 4-2. Yet the city refused to surrender. Why? Because surrender meant Nazi occupation, which Soviet propaganda correctly portrayed as worse than starvation. The Germans' own brutality, mass executions, slave labor, systematic starvation of prisoners, had unified Soviet resistance in a way communist ideology never could. And then there was the support arriving from abroad. In March 1941, the United States passed the Lend-Lease Act, allowing material aid to nations fighting the Axis. After Barbarossa, that aid flowed to the Soviet Union. By war's end, America had provided $11, $3 billion in supplies, equivalent to 15% of Soviet wartime production. The aid included 427,000 trucks, 13,000 locomotives, 15 million pairs of boots, and 4 million tons of food. Stalin himself admitted after the war, without Lend-Lease, we would have lost. The aid didn't win the war, but it freed Soviet industry to focus purely on weapons production, while American trucks moved Soviet armies and American locomotives hauled Soviet supplies. By summer 1942, the machinery of survival was in place. factories beyond German reach producing tanks in unprecedented numbers, a terror apparatus preventing collapse from within, and Allied aid sustaining logistics. But survival was not victory. The Germans still held the initiative, and in June 1942, Hitler launched another massive offensive aimed at the Soviet Union's southern oil fields. Case Blue was Hitler's gambit to win the war economically. If Germany could capture the Caucasus oil fields, the Wehrmacht would have fuel for its panzers, and the Soviet Union would be crippled. The offensive split into two thrusts, one toward Baku and the oil, the other toward Stalingrad on the Volga River. It was a strategic dispersal that weakened both advances, but Hitler became fixated on a city that bore Stalin's name. Stalingrad had limited strategic value, but it had immense symbolic weight. Hitler wanted it. Stalin would not give it up. And in that mutual obsession, the war's turning point was forged. On August 23, 1942, German forces reached the Volga River at Stalingrad. What followed was 5 months of the most savage urban combat in military history. Cities are terrible places to fight. They negate mobility, favor defenders, and turn every building into a fortress. The Germans had conquered Poland in 5 weeks, France in 6. Soviet General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the 62nd Army, pioneered tactics of hugging the enemy, keeping Soviet positions so close to German lines that the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb without hitting their own troops. The city became an apocalypse. Artillery reduced buildings to rubble, which provided better defensive positions than intact structures. Soldiers fought in sewers, factories, apartment blocks. Life expectancy for a Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was 24 hours. Snipers like Vasily Zaitsev became legends, with 225 confirmed kills. But most soldiers died anonymously in the grinding attrition. The Germans controlled 90% of the city by November, but they could not dislodge the last Soviet defenders clinging to the western bank of the Volga. And while the Germans fixated on the city, Soviet commanders were planning something audacious. On November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus was launched. Soviet forces attacked the weak Romanian armies guarding the German flanks north and south of Stalingrad. Within 4 days, the pincers met, encircling Paulus's entire 6th Army. 250,000 men trapped in a pocket with winter closing in. Hitler ordered Paulus to hold, promising air supply that never materialized. Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe couldn't deliver enough supplies to sustain 250,000 men. Soldiers starved. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees. Typhus spread. German forces attempted a relief operation in December, but were driven back. On February 2, 1943, Paulus surrendered. Of the 250,000 men encircled, 91,000 skeletal survivors marched into Soviet captivity. Newsreels of the prisoners, hollow-eyed, frostbitten, defeated, reverberated across the Reich. It was Germany's first major surrender, a propaganda disaster that shattered the myth of invincibility. The Führer's insistence on no retreat had destroyed an entire army. Soviet casualties at Stalingrad totaled 1.1 million. It was a victory won by outbleeding the enemy, by trading lives until German reserves were exhausted. It was not a humane strategy, it was not an efficient strategy, but it worked because the Soviet state could replace losses in ways Germany could not. The strategic initiative had permanently shifted, yet the Germans still had one more offensive left in them. In July 1943, Hitler ordered Operation Citadel, an offensive to eliminate the Kursk salient, a 120-mile bulge in the Soviet lines. It was Germany's last chance to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. Hitler concentrated 780,000 troops and 2,700 tanks, including the new Panthers and Tigers, for a double envelopment that would encircle Soviet forces and restore German momentum. But the Soviets knew it was coming. Intelligence had uncovered German plans. Zhukov and the Soviet General Staff prepared defenses in depth. Minefields, anti-tank ditches, artillery zones layered for hundreds of miles. When the Germans attacked on July 5th, they penetrated only 25 miles before grinding to a halt against prepared positions. On July 12th, at Prokhorovka, 1,500 tanks collided in the open steppe, the largest armored battle in history. Soviet T-34s charged German Panthers and Tigers at close range, where German armor advantages were negated. Smoke from burning tanks was visible for miles. Battlefield became a graveyard of steel. the Germans lost 760 tanks at Kursk. More critically, they lost the strategic reserve. After Kursk, Germany would never again launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. The Red Army held the initiative for the rest of the war. And that Red Army was no longer the panicked, disorganized force of 1941. It had learned. Soviet commanders had mastered combined arms warfare, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support into devastating offensives. Generals like Georgy Zhukov, Konstantin Rokossovsky, Ivan Konev, and Alexander Vasilevsky developed deep operations doctrine, break through enemy lines, then exploit into operational depth before the enemy could react. The Red Army that had fled in chaos in June 1941 had transformed into a sophisticated military machine by 1944. The Germans were learning a bitter lesson. Quantity has a quality all its own. Soviet factories were producing more tanks, more artillery, more aircraft than Germany could match. Lend-Lease trucks gave Soviet armies mobility the Wehrmacht had lost, and Soviet commanders had learned to use those resources effectively. In January 1944, the Red Army lifted the siege of Leningrad after 872 days. 1 million civilians had died, but the city had never surrendered. In the spring, Soviet offensives liberated Ukraine and Crimea, and then came the summer offensive that shattered the German Eastern Front forever. Operation Bagration launched on June 23, 1944, exactly 3 years after Barbarossa, was the Soviet answer to D-Day. While the Western Allies fought in Normandy, 2.3 million Soviet troops attacked 800,000 Germans in Belarus. The offensive was named for a Russian general who had fought Napoleon, a deliberate echo of 1812. This time, the invaders would be driven out. The results were catastrophic for Germany. Army Group Center was annihilated. By August, 450,000 German soldiers were dead or captured. The Soviets advanced 350 miles, liberated Minsk, and reached the outskirts of Warsaw. Bagration was larger than the Normandy invasion, resulted in more German casualties, and yet remains largely forgotten in Western historical memory. But on the Eastern Front, it was Bagration that permanently shattered German defensive cohesion. By the end of 1944, Soviet forces had reached the pre-war borders and entered Poland, Romania, and Hungary. The Red Army stood at the gates of the Reich. Germany's army was broken, its reserves exhausted, its industrial base collapsing under Allied bombing. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt. Only the timeline remained uncertain, and in January 1945, the Red Army provided the answer. The Vistula-Oder offensive launched on January 12, 1945, with Toulon Sticky washed, 2 million Soviet troops attacking from bridgeheads across the Vistula River in Poland. The Germans had fortified positions, but they no longer had the manpower or reserves to hold against Soviet momentum. Within 23 days, the Red Army advanced 300 miles, crossed the pre-war German border, and reached the Oder River, just 40 miles from Berlin. German casualties, 400,000. The Wehrmacht could no longer stop what was coming. Berlin. On April 16, 1945, the final offensive began. Zhukov's forces attacked from the east in a frontal assault across the Silo Heights. Konev's forces advanced from the south, encircling the capital. Berlin was defended by 1 million troops, a mix of Wehrmacht remnants, SS fanatics, Volkssturm militia of old men and boys, and Hitler Youth children given anti-tank rockets and sent to die for a regime in its death throes. The battle for Berlin was street by street, building by building. Soviet artillery reduced blocks to rubble. Katyusha rockets, Stalin's organs, screamed overhead. On May 2nd, Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag's dome, photographed in an image that would define Soviet victory. The battle for Berlin cost the Red Army 80,000 dead and 280,000 wounded. But the Reich had fallen. On May 9, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Soviet Union. In the West, the date was May 8th, a time zone difference that persists today, with Russia celebrating Victory Day on May 9th, while the West marks May 8th. That small discrepancy reflects a larger truth. The Soviet Union and the Western Allies fought parallel wars against Germany, and the Eastern Front was where the war was truly decided. The Red Army had destroyed the Wehrmacht. Of Germany's 13, 5 million military casualties, 10 million occurred on the Eastern Front. 80% of German losses came fighting the Soviet Union. The Western Allies' contribution was critical. Strategic bombing, Lend-Lease, and opening the Second Front in 1944 tied down German resources, but the war's weight fell on Soviet shoulders and broke Soviet backs. The cost was almost incomprehensible. 27 million Soviet citizens died, 11 million military deaths, 16 million civilians, starved in sieges, executed in occupied territories, worked to death in factories, bombed in cities. To put that in perspective, the United States lost 400,000 in the entire war. Britain lost 450,000. The Soviet Union lost 67 times more than America. Every Soviet family lost someone, a father, a son, a mother. There were no degrees of separation from the war's horror. It was intimate, personal, universal. The physical destruction matched the human toll. 1,710 cities destroyed, 70,000 villages burned, 30,000 factories demolished, 25% of the Soviet Union's capital stock obliterated. The Western territories were a wasteland of rubble and graves. And yet, the Soviet Union had survived when every rational calculation in 1941 predicted collapse. Why? Return to the question posed at the beginning. How did the state that should have shattered become the force that shattered Nazi Germany? The answer is not simple. It is not heroic. It is not ideologically satisfying. The Soviet Union survived because Stalin's totalitarian dictatorship could impose sacrifices that would have broken democratic societies. Order 227 shot retreating soldiers. Blocking detachments executed 158,000 of their own troops. Families of deserters were imprisoned. Entire ethnic groups were deported. Soviet commanders accepted casualty ratios, trading 2 Soviet lives for every German death. That would have been politically impossible in Britain or America. The Soviet Union survived because its geography was vast enough to swallow armies. Every mile the Germans advanced stretched their logistics thinner. Every mile the Soviets retreated brought them closer to reserves, reinforcements, and factories relocated beyond German reach. Space became a weapon. Distance became an ally. The Soviet Union survived because it achieved industrial mobilization unprecedented in scale. The evacuation of 1523 factories in 1941, operating in open air during reassembly, outproducing Germany by 1943, that was organizational capacity under catastrophe that few states could match. The Soviet Union survived because Allied support provided the logistics that enabled Soviet mobility. Lend-Lease's 427,000 trucks, 13,000 locomotives, 4 million tons of food freed Soviet industry to focus on weapons, while American trucks moved Soviet armies eastward to Berlin. The Soviet Union survived because the Red Army learned. The panicked, incompetent force of 1941 transformed into a sophisticated military machine by 1944, mastering combined arms warfare and deep operations that crushed German defenses. And the Soviet Union survived because the Germans made catastrophic errors, dividing forces at Kiev, fixating on Stalingrad, refusing to allow retreats that might have saved armies, underestimating Soviet resilience and will. But survival came at a price that raises uncomfortable questions. Was survival at the cost of 27 million lives of victory? The totalitarian state that killed millions of its own citizens in the 1930s purges proved capable of channeling that same brutality into military power in the 1940s. The machinery of dictatorship that oppressed the population enabled the mobilization that saved it. Is that a vindication of totalitarianism or an indictment of the choices war forces upon nations? The Soviet victory reshaped the world. The Red Army occupied Eastern Europe from the Baltic to the Balkans. Stalin imposed communist regimes in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. The Soviet Union emerged as a superpower, beginning a Cold War with its former Western allies that would define global politics for 45 years. The victory legitimized Stalin's dictatorship domestically, creating the mythology of the Great Patriotic War as the foundational narrative of Soviet identity. That narrative persists today. Modern Russia invokes the 1945 victory to justify authoritarianism, territorial expansion, and hostility toward the West. The survival mechanisms of 94-145, centralized control, acceptance of mass casualties, sacrifice of individual rights for state survival, echo in 21st century Russian strategic culture. The war's legacy is not just historical, it shapes geopolitics now. So, return once more to the central question. Why didn't the Soviet Union collapse? It didn't collapse because the totalitarian state could impose the unimaginable. It didn't collapse because geography provided space to trade for time. It didn't collapse because industrial mobilization outproduced the enemy. It didn't collapse because Allied support sustained logistics. It didn't collapse because the Red Army learned to fight. It didn't collapse because German errors were as decisive as Soviet actions. But perhaps the deepest answer is this: the Soviet Union didn't collapse because its people, terrorized by their own government, facing annihilation from invaders, chose survival over surrender. Not because they loved Stalin or believed in communism, but because the alternative was extinction. They fought because retreating meant execution, advancing meant possible survival, and surrender meant death in German captivity, where 57% of Soviet POWs died. 27 million dead, so the state could live. The tanks that reached Berlin in May 1945 rolled over mountains of Soviet corpses higher than any the Germans could build. Victory came not because of the system's strength, but because the system could force its population to pay a price no other nation would accept. The Soviet Union's survival stands as history's darkest paradox. It endured because the same totalitarian machinery that made it vulnerable through purges and terror could impose mobilization and sacrifice impossible in freer societies. The question is not whether that survival was miraculous. It was. The question is whether survival purchased at such cost, enabling a totalitarian state to dominate half of Europe for half a century, can ever truly be called victory. The red flag flew over the Reichstag. But it was raised by soldiers who fought with German guns before them and NKVD pistols behind them, representing a state that survived by consuming its own population as fuel for the war machine. That is the truth of Soviet survival. Neither heroic nor villainous, but brutally, uncomfortably human, a nation that refused to die, no matter how many of its citizens had to.